Capital Record, where we defend free enterprise and capital markets because we believe in the dignity of the human person.
Well, hello and welcome to David Bonson's Capital Record, brought to you by National Review, which is a fun part of what I'm doing today, speaking of National Review, because I'm going to dedicate our time in the Capital Record today to responding to what was actually an article written by a National Review writer in National Review online, and I am going to be taking a very critical perspective. The article is by Brendan Dougherty, and it is called "Why I Will Never Be a Free Trader." And the title of my podcast today is "Why I Will Always Be a Free Trader." Now, I want to set the stage a little bit here because those who actually really know me, which of course, most people listen to a podcast or reading a book or a Dividend Cafe commentary or something, they come at it from the vantage point of some certain degree of a public profile, but not the advantage of personal knowledge or relationship. And that's just a limiting reality of those of us that do certain things in public life. That people out there don't necessarily know the real you. It's fine. It is what it is. But those who do know me actually know that I really am a can't we all get along kind of person deep down. And in fact, I'm working on some writing about this in a different venue outside of the economics domain that I've been working on for a long time, that I hope to have out in written form soon. But the National Review community means a great deal to me, and the conservatism cause, for which I consider National Review to be a vital vessel, means a great deal to me. And one of the hardest parts for me over the last 10 years has actually not merely been where there are ideological or political or philosophical differences with populism or Trumpism or what have you, the sort of well-discussed rift that is often surfaced amongst those on the right. Those debates and whatnot are sometimes problematic. There have been personal disappointments that have surfaced where I have deemed certain individuals to be not operating in good faith or to be, let's say, improperly motivated in their change of view on something. And other times it's just a disagreement. You've changed your view, and I liked your old view better than your new view. And that's where I find myself with a lot of folks in the so-called new right. And it warrants discussion. It warrants, dealing with it. And I don't get often that into the weeds about where I think people's motives are wrong or where I think people are partaking in some sort of a cowardly action in moving towards a MAGA approach or something, because I don't know everyone's motives, and those things, get fought out on social media. My objective, especially here in Capital Record, has been very, very substantively minded, which is that there is a real movement afoot to blame markets for certain things that people believe to be wrong in society, and in particular to undermine the tenets of fusionism, whereby certain long-held and long-heralded beliefs in a free society and in a virtuous society, that fusion that recognizes certain concepts like, let's say, sphere sovereignty or independent functions in given realms of society. That fusionism is a cause I believe in. And I rather spend my time arguing for it and against its critics than getting into the kind of fights of things that have come up. And along the way, there are people that I like a lot that do take a substantive view on a topic I disagree with, and I still believe in public discourse. And that's what I want to do today with Michael about the issue of free trade. Michael and I know each other for a long time. We've spent a decent amount of time together, broken bread together, been at events together, and shared private correspondence together. And I like Michael a great deal and consider Michael a friend. And I can't speak for what Michael thinks about me. I hope that he likes me, and I don't think I've given him any reason not to. but I know he disagrees with me on some of these issues, and I disagree with him. And I'm about to disagree in a rather direct way with the substance of an argument made in this piece, Why I Will Never Be a Free Trader. But when I say this stuff is hard in the sense of my can't we all get along disposition, it's because I really do write this, or excuse me, speak this stuff today from the vantage point of desiring a lot of unity in the conservative world. And this is an important topic where I believe the principles that those of us who are free traders are fighting for deserve to be represented in a much more fair way than I think Michael's recent article sought to treat the free trade argument, and in particular, one of the other National Review writers, Dominic Pino, who's been on this podcast before. But I also believe that at the heart of the matter here is the need for a reminder of why we bring first principles to economic discussions, why we bring first principles to general political prudence, why we advocate as conservatives for something called a limiting principle. There's a number of fallacies in Michael's approach to this subject that are revealed in his argumentation that I think really do get down to the heart of what Capital Record is about. So it is my goal to treat this topic with civility and charity, and yet hopefully drive, for those of you who are just outside readers, outside listeners, not interested in the intramural drama of things, which is where I hope most of you are. And it's where healthy people are, by the way. The intent here is to staunchly reaffirm the propriety of the free trade position. The copy starts off Michael's article, and I recognize this is probably from an editor, not Michael itself, a poll quote, which is later quoted near the end of his piece. But at the very top, it states, "A global free market doesn't care if America remains the preeminent nation on earth or if it is reduced to one giant soybean farm to feed a Chinese state." And though I'm trying to walk through now Michael's article in order with my own comments and critique, and this comment actually in Michael's article appeared in his conclusion at the beginning, the fact that it serves as a preface, as a poll quote at the very beginning, foundationally, I think helped set the table for what is going to prove to be a substantial problem in Michael's thinking. Well, a global free market doesn't care if America remains the preeminent nation on earth. Well, that's certainly true. But an American free market most certainly does. And of course, if we're talking about systems that don't care about us potentially becoming a giant soybean farm, feeding a Chinese state, and these different, dramatic arguments that are intended to say that a global free market just can't deliver those things that really matter, and in fact could very easily go this other very bad way. The fact of the matter is that a global socialist, a global mercantilist, a global interventionist, collectivist system doesn't care either. At the heart of the matter, for those who do desire America to remain a preeminent nation and to properly define what it means to be a preeminent nation, it requires us to understand what a market is, and pitting the advocacy of free markets against the ultimate aim of a virtuous society, of these conditions for human flourishing. This fundamentally misunderstands the very definition of a market, and therefore allows itself to set rules of debate that are entirely unfair and in fact ludicrous. That the free exchange between people does not in and of itself speak to what is being exchanged, doesn't speak to the motives of exchange, doesn't speak to a number of elements that are important to the well-being of the people involved. Markets are humans acting, and there is an entire ecosystem around it in public policy, in our personal functions, our personal roles, characters, and habits that all come in. But setting the stage by saying a global free market doesn't care is a well poisoning of the most illogical kind. And I'm going to unpack more throughout. Now, the well poisoning these days, I mentioned these last 10 years and this sort of post-liberal desire to suggest that the conservative endeavor failed, and in a lot of cases, sometimes that the entire American experiment failed. Love this term that Michael uses in his very opening paragraph, the post-Cold War globalization consensus. And I have found that often, but not always, when those words get used, an extraordinary straw man is coming. And that doesn't mean it always is, and I would have loved for Michael to not be guilty of that, but alas, I wrote down straw man coming when I read post-Cold War globalization consensus, and then I got to wait about 5 more words before hearing that if facilitating the ever freer movement of goods, capital, and people across borders was not just beneficial, but was really something closer to a mandate derived from our understanding of human rights, upon which democratic publics through their government should be forbidden from trespassing, like the right of free speech or free exercise of religion. In other words, free traders hold to this idea that an ever freer movement of goods and capital is not only beneficial, but is derived from our basic understanding of human rights, and that a government should be forbidden from any form of trespassing like free speech or free religion. And again, this is not an argument that Michael roots to any particular quote or source, but perhaps he detects a dogmatism or an absolutism in others. He does attempt throughout his article to try to quote certain people that he thinks demonstrate a rule. This is, of course, what the straw man argument is by definition. Free traders believe X, quote one free trader who seems to be referencing X, and then assign that belief to all. It isn't a very serious form of logical argumentation, nor is the idea that free exchange is attached in the founder's understanding or in the conservative argument since to the same argument for natural rights, by which our Bill of Rights attaches the right of free speech or free exercise of religion. Including in free speech and free religion, by the way, are various limiting principles, but nevertheless, there is a high regard for free speech and free exercise of religion attached to a very specific understanding of natural rights that is core to the American ethos. And there is a sense in which Michael wants to attach the argument for free trade and the well-being of society that it represents, the opportunity for economic growth that hindering it represents, into the same sense, into the same argument. And this poisoning the well is basically arguing that all free, and by the way, you notice he says the free movement of goods, capital, and people. There's an immigration issue brought up, and then, of course, in the case of goods, free trade argument brought up, and with capital, it would be a very interesting thing for the advocates of restricting the movement of goods and the advocates of the restricting of the movement of peoples. In other words, the more anti-immigration and more anti-trade folks to say that they do want to apply that same argumentation to the free flow of capital. That's not an argument I've heard them make, but it would be interesting to argue for domesticating capital, that for not allowing the free flow of capital outside the United States. I will take for granted that those listening right now understand I say that with a heavy degree of sarcasm, knowing the utter pandemonium that would represent to the quality of life of Americans, to find out that the free flow of capital was now being restricted the way that many advocate for a more onerous immigration or goods. But lumping all three of these things together is problematic in the sense that every consistent conservative understands different parameters by the nature of things, of what people are, of what goods are, and of what capital is. I myself, when you take the free flow of people, do advocate for the freedom of people to leave the country freely and to not be forced to stay inside the country. And I'm an absolutist on that. I also believe that's totally consistent with the belief that while I love immigration and love people coming in the country has every right to have rules about who comes in and the parameters around them coming in, and particularly those seeking to obtain citizenship. Nevertheless, as we go through Michael's argument, he states that he, and I quote, free traders have a special allergy to the preemptive insistence that one policy is always optimal in every circumstance of human affairs. Well, I don't know. That old advocating for first principles is, in my opinion, the job of all of us who are seeking to be cogent thinkers. And the idea that a special allergy to preemptive insistence that one policy is always optimal in circumstances of human affairs, I don't know anyone who really believes that. But if what he is suggesting is problematic, is the intention of free traders to have first principles. Not that one policy is always optimal, but rather that there are first principles that govern how we approach policy, and this includes the notion of free trade. He states that a global free market is indifferent to the distribution of goods, skills, technological capacities, and power among nations. I think that is untrue, but I think it's a weird statement. But then what he says second is statesmen cannot be so indifferent. And this is a theme of his piece, that somehow they're the way markets are supposed to be and the way statesmen are supposed to be. And I guess I would ask, if statesmen cannot be indifferent to the distribution of goods, skills, capacities, and power, I ask, can they have standards that are anti-protectionist? To the extent a statesman, and Michael and I would agree, has a standard that goes merely beyond the efficiency of exchange of goods, can those standards by which statesmen go about that process, in other words, surpass indifference, as he suggests, may that standard be itself anti-protectionist? Michael would say no, and has written a lengthy piece trying to defend protectionism. I would argue that he's creating a false dilemma, that one can be the type of statesman he's advocating without having to succumb to the vast dangers of protectionism. Now, I will commend him that he points out Hamilton. And I quote, Hamilton decisively expands the question beyond economic efficiency to encompass larger political and geopolitical considerations. This is more honest about Hamilton than typical revisionists who paint him as a rank protectionist. What Michael's pointing out here is not something any Hamiltonian free trader, of which I am, denies. That in our belief system about trade and about free exchange, we want to surpass merely economic efficiency, and that there are other political and geopolitical considerations. I agree with Michael that Hamilton believed that, and I believe that. He goes on to quote Roger Scruton, who is just a remarkable English philosopher. And this is where all of a sudden I think things are beginning to break down. That he says, regulatory regime will maximize trade with its neighbors. And again, I'm coming in the middle of the quote here. It's for each nation to establish the regulatory regime that will maximize trade with its neighbors while protecting local customs, moral ideals, and privileged relations on which national identity depends. And I don't think Michael understands how incredibly pro-free trade this Scruton comment is. The limiting principles, while we're seeking to maximize trade with neighbors, which sounds to me like a very free trade aspiration, is protecting local customs, moral ideals, privileged relations. This is not about the economic protectionism that all anti-free trade has now moved to. The entire theory of the case now in contemporary protectionism, mercantilism, and economic nationalism is centering around something entirely different than protecting local customs, moral ideals, etc. Now, he says global free trade advocates propose their policy as a natural consequence and outgrowth of human reciprocity and creativity, with a result of maximal economic efficiency, prosperity, and flourishing. To which I say, correct, fair enough. Then Michael goes on to say, but in history and in reality, free trade looks more like a geopolitical regime imposed from above, a subordinate of the foreign policy of supreme naval powers. And there's other places where this kind of line of thinking resurfaces. This is very bizarre that what we are seeing here is, well, it may seem like it's free trade, but really the military superpowers are imposing their will, that it is not fair. And in fact, particularly the subordinate of the foreign policy of supreme naval powers, my friends, who has supreme naval powers in global free trade? I think it's us. I am mystified by how the argument has been made time and time again that America's getting its lunch eaten, that we are getting killed by Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and Vietnam, and that the Chinese and others are big countries, small countries, that we're getting ripped off all over the world, always by countries that are growing far less than us, always by countries that have a lower standard of living, always by countries not seeing their national prosperity grow the way ours is. But that what we're told here is we got to be careful about this free trade stuff, because really free trade just advantages military superpowers. But we're the military superpower. Now, he goes on to say, it is not an unmixed blessing. The political entanglement of nations that trade with each other is not an unmixed blessing. And I want to comment on that, but he says, again, I want to finish his thought. Unilateral free trade with nations of radically dissimilar laws, unfree peoples, or predatory mercantile industrial policy undermines the very virtues on which the market economy justifies itself. But now we're getting into the basic question here, is who is to govern? Who adjudicates these the disparities that this allegedly creates? That some form of free trade where people have different rules. Now, I don't believe Michael would say he doesn't believe in Minnesota trading with Texas or California trading with Arizona. But again, there are going to be different rules domestically. There are going to be different rules in counties. There are going to be different domains that set this and weigh market adherence, even nationalistic market adherence, deal with those differences in economic actors doing business together, is by saying the economic actor adjudicates. That if there is a disparity that is affecting someone who is a party to the transaction, they would make that decision. And that the last actor we need adjudicating where those things are happening and becoming predatory or mercantilist by nature of their own industrial policy is Washington, D.C., let alone Washington, D.C. treating mercantile or predatory or industrial policy actions of others with its own predatory mercantilist industrial policy actions. But again, despite the sort of internal contradiction of what is being asserted, it also is basically getting to the heart of the matter with the fundamental question, who? Who is to make this call? And this becomes the big theme throughout Michael's piece, is a defense of the state against markets as the natural adjudicator, and his criticism of the free trade argument, and in fact his insinuation that free traders are making a utopian market argument in their critique of a non-utopian state. It simply assumes a lack of conflict that is normal in human affairs, the free trade thesis. No, it does the opposite. It assumes that there will be conflict in human affairs and that cronyism is worse, that the state having to interfere to adjudicate in the various conflicts and disparities that exist is not any kind of solution. Pursuing such policies naively leaves one exposed to predators. But I ask you, are we exposing ourselves to predators freely? Is that what it means to be exposed to predators? Freely exposed to predators? Or are we trying to avoid the deep predatory reality of low-cost T-shirts by inviting the predator of state intervention? See, this is the issue at the heart of the matter. I will quote Michael word for word here. The free traders view their policy as a messianic mission of achieving peace by facing the existence of nations and need for politics altogether. We see this not just explicitly through their speeches in history, but implicitly in their constant denigration of state power, even when it's recognized legitimate and necessary. This is not a sentence to take seriously. But I just want to know if MBD wants that shoe on the other foot. Okay, the mercantilism and corruption of what he proposes also does not bring in a messianic mission of achieving peace. The fact that he's using a rank straw man argument that no free trader believes that there is messianic peace achieved through free trade does not then satisfy my own argument. I believe it is helpful to point out that Michael's making an unfair argument against free traders. But ultimately, what I want to ask is, which system is better? That there will be imperfections and differences between trading partners is not something that we can let go of. We recognize is table stakes. In which system are those things more thoroughly addressed? One in which the actors doing the adjudication are inside transactions, or one in which they are external to transactions? This seems to me to be the heart of the matter. When he goes on to say at the end of that paragraph that free traders are trying to usher in a new kind of life for man defined exclusively by exchange, this is the stuff where, again, I can forgive him as my friend and colleague, but it's just a thing no person confident in their own position would say. It is such an absurd straw man argument, and again, I think he knows that. Well, he goes on to spend a very lengthy part of his article critiquing our National Review, our fellow National Review colleague, Dominic Pino, who is, like myself, a free trader. And Dominic stated in his piece that protectionism is a utopian theory based on the assumptions that individuals and businesses will act contrary to their self-interest, the government will act in the national interest, and special interests will stay on the sidelines. Free trade is how you live your everyday life. And he says citation is very much needed. And no, it isn't. Dominic is making an ideological argument. He's drawing inferences from the premises and conclusions of protectionism. The idea that he is stating everyone would explicitly state this is untrue. My argument about the rhetoric and the arguments and the implications of protectionism do not mean that all protectionists are ideologically self-conscious, self-aware. What we're referring to is the implications of a protectionist argument that deifies the state and I believe denigrates the human will and human freedom to a point that is very problematic. The issue is not one of perfection in a free trade system versus imperfection. It's, does government having its fingers on the scale advance national interest? And I believe sometimes it can, but what is the limiting principle? Here is where I believe protectionists have no answer. When he will criticize Dominic for suggesting that protectionism lends itself to special interest, and he will come out and say, oh, come on, no government can be perfect. This is utopian theory that markets are going to be perfect. Actually, government should act in the national interest, which Dominic and I would agree with, and there's no other job for government but to act in the national interest. My whole point is not that a government should not act in the national interest. It's what is the legitimacy of their action, in what domain, what are those limiting principles, and I don't believe this is one that protectionists are seeking to answer. Now, in him trying to critique this fallibility that we would point out in governmental solutions to the issue of trade, he says something rather helpful to the conversation. No economic actor, not a single firm, hedge fund, father, or laborer, could survive this demand to prove themselves infallible calculators before qualifying themselves to make economic decisions. Absolutely true. The state cannot be a perfect, infallible economic actor, an economic calculator, and neither can a hedge fund or a father or a laborer. However, there is one really big difference that is the heart of the matter in all classical economics and all of our advocacy for a free enterprise system. The standard is not perfection. Otherwise, Michael's right that everybody would fail. Rather, though, the standard must be, when he, again, using Michael's own language here, most people in firm make mistakes. That's how they gather information and learn and adapt. But see, the standard is not perfection. It is skin in the game. It is economic pain and pleasure. When Michael says that people in firm make mistakes and they gather information, learn, and adapt, the point is the state doesn't. The state does not gather information, learn, and adapt the same way the private sector does, for it cannot, because it doesn't feel the economic pleasure of good economic calculation, and it doesn't feel the economic pain of bad economic education. Heads, the state wins. Tails, the state wins. It is making decisions as a disinterested third party. There are people in private enterprise that feel the consequences and adapt quicker and better. They have knowledge and incentives, the two cornerstones of a market economy, the reasons for why we advocate market actors making decisions, including decisions of trade and allocation of resources, as opposed to a disinterested third party making those decisions on their behalf. I fully agree with Michael that because the state will be an imperfect actor is not conclusive, and that there will be imperfections from others. The categorical difference, though, not only is there a degree of difference between the imperfections of state economic calculation and private sector calculation. I hope I don't have to defend that claim, that there is a wide chasm between the fallibility. However, there is also a categorical difference of kind around skin in the game. Economic actors that feel pain and pleasure from their decisions. He goes on to say that no single protectionist objects to the division of labor, and he's sort of doing to Dominic what I'm doing to him. I'm accusing Michael of frequent use of the straw man fallacy, and he is stating that Dominic is guilty of a straw man by trying to say all protectionists are against division of labor. And it's certainly true that not all protectionists are fully against division of labor, but they certainly truncate it. They certainly minimize it and reduce it to something that is far less efficacious and powerful. Quoting Dominic, he says, protectionism says that the natural human regard for self-interest that undergirds trade is actually a disease in need of treatment. It posits that people need to act contrary to human nature to really thrive, and that therefore their desires and preferences must be reformed. The agent of that reformation is the government. Dominic is 100% right here. This is fundamentally what the debate is about. And so I think it is helpful for us to get on the other side of the various straw men and come down to some conclusions as to what we believe the proper function of government is, where it exists and where it doesn't. Michael will attempt to provide some standards for that here, and I want to interact with those. He points out, by the way, that this whole talk about self-interest, is a little bit misguided as we quote our patron saint Adam Smith around it, because Adam Smith himself reigned suspicion of self-interest as a disease. He inherited from Christian theology through Augustine and Aquinas that self-love is the cause of every sin, and he accurately quotes much about Adam Smith. But the whole point here is what Michael himself says, that Smith argued that ultimately this free exchange and mankind being free to operate as that self-interested economic actor channels man's self-interest into productive work that serves and benefits others. But Michael goes on to say, though, that the free trader is no less dependent on or needful of a competent and beneficent government than the protectionist. But see, the difference is the free trader knows the limiting principles set by knowledge and incentives. There is a competent you want a competent government involved in certain elements of defending rule of law. But there is, I think, a categorical difference in what we're asking government to do. And the advocacy we have here, and for those of us defending a free society, and the way I've tried to approach this in Capital Record, is that the limiting principle is set by the knowledge problem Friedrich Hayek so eloquently taught us about, and the basic reality of incentives as understood as creational norms. That mankind will be better in making certain individual economic decisions for themselves than a disinterested third party because of those very incentives. So when we talk about what Adam Smith said and didn't say, believed and didn't believe, and where there will be government involved, the question becomes, what are the limiting principles we want to have for that government? And the idea that a free trader doesn't understand the need for a limited form of government is untrue. Now, where does a free trader want to set those principles? It is within the limiting principles that I think are broadly helped understood within knowledge principles and incentive principles. Where does the protectionist set it? Why does the protectionist set it wherever they set it? You will see that there are some problems here in those principle setting in Michael's own argumentation. He states that our founders taught us governments are instituted most likely to affect their safety and happiness. If government is not for us, what is it for? Fair, but of course, again, there is a limiting principle to government's for that makes us against a welfare state. Government, in my opinion, here, where I think Michael wants to go, and again, in the paragraph that I'm quoting from, he talks about that, judges have to adjudicate complex contracts, cops have to police, in transient thieves, that the failures of governance are not a justification for anarchy. And that all the protectionists are doing is simply, and I'm quoting Michael, they simply expect governments to think more broadly. But they obviously are doing a lot more than that. We are not merely talking about thinking more broadly, and there's nothing simple about it. We're asking them to set the rules of trade, and we're asking them to set the rules of trade in such a way as to penalize some and benefit others. This is itself a mission by Michael, that whatever it is he considers to be a limiting principle for markets is not a limiting principle for the government. Moving on, I will anecdotally point out he refers to a recent transaction where he had found a Russian guitar pedal maker on Instagram, and they found a way to legally trade, and that he himself is not always against, exchanging goods. And I just sort of tongue-in-cheek, but sort of not, anecdotally want to point out that, of course, in Michael buying a pedal maker from a Russian and buying a guitar pedal from a Russian guitar pedal maker, he has clearly shown disregard for his American guitar pedal makers, but nevertheless, I appreciated his candor. As we move on, there's something Michael did that I think is really, really helpful, and frankly appreciate it. I was a bit surprised, but he says that the massive in critiquing Britain's trade policies of the 20th century, and 19th century into the 20th century, and stating where he's concerned for what America's done. He says, the massive profits from productive manufacturing supremacy attracts and strengthens financial institutions. The trading floors where capital markets are made and prosperity expanded. And attaining both industrial and financial dominance is the prelude to geopolitical supremacy. I do not gather in this that he was trying to be sarcastic. I believe he's saying it seriously. I agree 100% with his argument. His nod to the importance of capital markets is noted and appreciated. I believe one will find that sometimes that is not necessarily the way Michael will reason about financial markets and institutions, but what he's attempting to say here is that the United States surrendering industrial supremacy weakens our financial institutions and therefore creates a setback for us in terms of our own geopolitical supremacy. And I think he believes he's being clever in saying that China, despite their lack of infallible regulators, have succeeded in this massive transfer of knowledge and technology. I guess he doesn't see the irony here, that much of where China has been able to gain an upper hand, he acknowledges, by the way, that America has hardly surrendered. This is where I just don't understand. He says, so far the United States has only partly surrendered industrial dominance, so that's good. It's going to be a very tricky place for protectionists to argue that somehow the United States has failed as industrial supremacy. But if he would argue, which I think he is, that we have marginally surrendered that, I wonder if he might point out that while he points out these wonderful Chinese regulators that have done such a great job there, is it possible that some of the surrender of our industrial positioning has come because of our own policy framework, our own regulatory apparatus? Have our, yes, infallible, but still A-OK regulators been part of the problem here? This, to me, is the great tragedy of protectionism in attempting to solve for other elements in the economy it's unsatisfied with, how it fails to see that other elements, I've talked about monetary policy, interventionism, about a greater, more burdensome tax and regulatory framework, have themselves avoided the proper indictment and trial they deserve because we have moved the ball elsewhere. So again, I don't want to re-quote every one of these straw men where he talks about free trade's major advocates vow their policy will cause peace. He says the distaste Pino expresses for government, in his case for free trade, has strong antecedents in his tradition. And I just want to point out that tradition he refers to is not Pino's tradition. It's the National Review tradition. It's Bill Buckley's tradition. It's the conservatism tradition. It's the American ideals tradition. Now, you could take certain quotes out of context. Bastiat of goods don't cross borders, soldier will. You can even take some people that maybe do say crazy things. Maybe there are people, I think Bastiat saying that if goods don't cross borders, soldiers will is a totally innocuous quote when properly contextualized. But maybe there are people that oversold the peace advantages that would come from trade, or maybe they overly absolutized those things. I haven't read it, I haven't seen it, but if it exists, it's still a straw man that is nowhere near indicative of the underlying argument. But I guess I would pose a question in trying to critique an argument that I don't think exists, an absolutism about what trade can deliver in terms of peace and harmony. Are we actually suggesting that it doesn't marginally improve the conditions for peace? Are we actually suggesting that while free trade cannot guarantee perfect peace and avoidance of political consideration, that there is no marginal proclivity for countries that trade with one another and have some sort of economic reciprocity and mutual advantage and mutual cooperation versus countries that don't have any trading relationship or economic participation in each other's well-being at all? The idea that if it isn't absolute, it doesn't do anything is ridiculous. The idea that it is absolute is not true, but nor does anyone say that it is. But so much time in this article is spent trying to critique a view that nobody holds, it helps him to ignore the far more important point. That obviously trade is marginally beneficial in the neighborly relations that countries will have. Now, again, this I alluded to this earlier. As we get closer to his conclusion, he says a universal subjection of the less advanced, and he's actually quoting here Friedrich List, but again, favorably quoting, some of his favorite protectionists throughout history. The result of a general free trade would not be a universal republic, but a universal subjection of the less advanced nations to the predominant manufacturing, commercial, and naval power. It's a conclusion for which the reasons are very strong. This is seriously the most anti-Trumpist argument ever. The entire Trumpist argument for 2025 protectionism has been that we have ceded power, that despite us being this predominant naval power, that all these other nations are eating our lunch. It's the exact opposite argument that Michael and his historical allies are making. So to get closer to conclusion here, quoting Henry Clay, says, "To be free, it should be fair, equal, and reciprocal, but equal and reciprocal free trade never has existed and never will exist," said Henry Clay. And I would say that's because these terms cannot be defined. The question remains not, is this trade becoming perfectly equal or reciprocal? For those of us who understand the definition of subjective theory of value, I would suspect that there will always be elements of perceived inequality and non-reciprocity. But either way, even when we're not merely just talking about you got your $5 and I got my coffee, and that seems unequal because I didn't even want the $5 anymore. I wanted the coffee and I got it. Ha ha. Michael would define that as equal, and I would define that as equal, even though those terms do not apply there in the sense of subjective value. Those things are what make a market. However, the thing Michael's trying to get down to and bring Roger Scruton and Henry Clay onto his side in doing is who gets to decide. Is perfect fairness and reciprocity possible in a mercantilist economy? Is it possible in a fully domesticated nationalistic economy? Would there be challenges of perfect fairness, equality, reciprocity in any system? I know that these systems can certainly add to our national poverty. I have no doubt about that. But what we are fundamentally talking about here is what economic actor gets to make the decision about reciprocity and equality. The actor in the transaction or the disinterested third party. This is the fundamental issue when it comes down to free trade. Now, the biggest critics, and I'm ready to get to my conclusion here now, so thank you for bearing with me. It's hard to do all this by just walking through page by page of the article, but hopefully I've been able to cover the major points I want to do. Michael says, and I alluded to this at the very beginning, that statesmen must engage occasionally some zero-sum thinking of winners and losers. And I think statesmen can do that in their armchair, daydreaming about what to do with other people's money. But no, I do not believe that a statesman is supposed to occasionally pontificate about zero-sum thinking. Economic transactions are not zero-sum. The fact of the matter is that even a statesman who loves his country does operate under certain limiting principles and first principles. And one of these principles that we must rigorously defend is the right of free men and women to transact, and including in those principles of transaction, principles of comparative advantage. It is not just that I believe men should be free to buy a guitar pedal from Russia, a Russian guitar pedal maker, as Michael did. It is not just that I believe we should be free to buy coffee from Brazil and bananas from climates that can make far more than we can for far less cost. I believe that it impoverishes us if we don't do so. I believe it makes us wealthy when we do so. That these are basic comparative advantages that are non-controversial in history, and that where countries have participated in these utterly logical examples of free men and free markets, we have made the national prosperity better. And statesmen not only ought to think about that, they better think about it. Do I believe that's all they should think about, is where to source the cheaper bananas? I do not. The straw man that people like Vice President Vance have used a lot, saying, oh, well, we got a cheaper toaster, but we sold out a whole city. They, again, are cheap shot arguments, substitute for real argumentation, because, first of all, no one's talking about a cheaper toaster. What we are talking about is trillions of dollars of cheaper goods that millions of Americans are able to buy and become better off by being able to buy cheaper goods while being able to move to different resources that are more opportunistic. And if one wants to argue that a statesman would say, no, we must do nothing that will impede upon the ability of us to make all of our own t-shirts, despite the fact that we can make t-shirts cheaper elsewhere, we not only disagree politically, we not only disagree economically, we disagree morally. I do not merely believe that a statesman doesn't have to think like a protectionist. I believe a statesman better not think like a protectionist, for it impoverishes the people of the state that the statesman is obligated to care about. Back to the quote that I referenced in the poll quote at the beginning. A global free market doesn't care if America remains the preeminent nation on earth, if it's reduced to one giant soybean farm to feed a Chinese state that politically dominates Eurasia and the Pacific Rim. The very virtues its defenders identify in such an arrangement preclude consideration of these matters. That is untrue, my friend. That is untrue. He concludes by saying, independence and liberty have a price, but most of us will be glad to have paid. The price of liberty and independence is exactly what I'm referring to. And I believe we maintain our independence and liberty by not ceding control over these economic exchange decisions to a disinterested third party who can and will only do one thing: make either corrupt decisions or inefficient decisions or ignorant decisions that stem from the lack of knowledge and the lack of incentives to do any better. The political self-interest is no more morally impressive than economic self-interest. Economic self-interest, channeled through the very things that Michael and I would collectively defend, these mediating institutions, the need for character formation in society, for moral formation of the human person, these are not in the purview of the state. And what markets are is very important. Markets are fundamentally free people transacting. Where virtue is instilled is not in trade agreements or in tariffs. Where virtue is instilled is where we get past armchair statesmen pontificating about a zero-sum world. Where virtue gets instilled is where men and women are formed with the necessary understanding of ethics, of morality, of transcendent biblical truth to drive decision-making, and to do so in the context of a free society whereby people become freer to exchange as they see fit, freer to produce as they see fit, to sell and buy in a way that drives their own self-interest, and in so doing make others better off as well. This is, of course, the synthesis that formulates my economic worldview, this juxtaposition of a free and virtuous society. It's why I will remain always and forever a free trader. Thank you for listening to David Bahnsen's Capital Record.